word apocalypse carries a tremendous amount of cultural baggage. I mean, you say it, and immediately the mind goes to zombies or nuclear winter, the collapse of civilization, or at the very least, a distinct lack of coffee.
Right, yeah. That is the pop culture definition, certainly. It is a disaster torn. It's the screen fading to black.
But we have a stack of research on the desk today, specifically looking at Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 1, that suggests we have the definition completely wrong. And if we get the definition of apocalypse wrong, we might actually misunderstand the entire Christian gospel.
We really might. Because in the Greek, apocalypsis doesn't mean the end of the world. It doesn't mean destruction at all.
It means an unveiling.
Exactly, a revealing. It is the act of pulling back a heavy curtain to show you what has been sitting in the room with you the entire time unseen.
And that is the lens for today's deep dive. We are looking at Romans chapter 1, which is arguably the most influential text in Western history. I mean, it changed Augustine, it changed Luther, it changed Wesley.
It changed the world.
It did. But we aren't just reading it today. We are analyzing it through the minds of three heavyweight scholars who, frankly, do not agree on what this text is doing.
They really don't. And that friction is useful for us. It stops us from just nodding along and forces us to ask what Paul is actually saying here.
We're going to get to the scholars Mu, Schreiner, and Gaventa in a moment. But I want to stick with this apocalypse concept for a second. Why is this the starting point for Romans 1?
Because Paul describes a conflict here where two things are being unveiled, two apocalypses, really simultaneously. On one side, you have the righteousness of God being revealed. That's the hero of the story entering the stage. But simultaneously, just a verse later in verse 18, we are told that the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven.
So it's not a sequence. It's not here is the bad news and later we will get to the good news.
No, and that's crucial for understanding the tension of this entire chapter. It's a collision. It's a flash of lightning that illuminates two things at once, the rescue and the danger.
Because most people read Romans 1 and think it's just a list of vices, don't do this list.
Right, a moralistic checklist. But the commentaries we have today suggest something far more terrifying and also more hopeful. They suggest the world hasn't just been quote-unquote bad, it has been handed over. We are looking at a cosmic battlefield, and the weapon of choice on this battlefield is the gospel.
Handed over. That sounds incredibly ominous.
It is arguably the darkest concept in the chapter.
Okay, before we get into the darkness of that, we need to introduce our guys for this deep dive. We are navigating this battlefield with three distinct maps. Who are these scholars, and why do they view the terrain so differently?
We have a fascinating spread here. First, you have Douglas Moo. He wrote the commentary for the NICNT series. If I had to give him a persona to help us track his arguments as we go, I'd call him the jurist.
The jurist, why?
Because he is a classic Reformed scholar. He's very balanced, very concerned with history, but his primary lens is legal. When he reads Romans, he sees a courtroom.
God is the judge. Humanity is in the dock.
Exactly. And the main question is about legal standing. He is deeply concerned with salvation history, how the Old Testament flows into the New.
Okay, so we have the jurist. Who is next?
Then we have Thomas Schreiner from the BECNT series. I call him the defender.
What exactly is he defending?
The traditional view of the gospel against modern reinterpretations. Schreiner is Baptist, Reformed, and incredibly precise with his exegesis, but he is polemical.
He's ready for a fight.
He is. He is actively fighting against views that soften the idea of God's wrath or shift the focus away from individual salvation, things like the new perspective on Paul.
Which we'll get into a bit later.
We will. But if Moo is the judge, Schreiner is the lawyer making the closing argument for the prosecution. He wants to make sure you understand exactly what the text says, even if it makes you intensely uncomfortable.
And the third scholar?
The third is the disruptor, Beverly Roberts Gaventa, writing the NTL commentary. She is the apocalypticist.
Hence the intro to our show today.
Exactly. While Moo and Schreiner are looking at legal standings in courtrooms, Gaventa is looking at cosmic powers. She sees sin and death not just as bad things we do, but as enslaved powers, literally capital S sin, that have captured humanity. She argues that Romans isn't about a trial, it's about an invasion.
So we have a judge, a defender, and a general looking at a war map.
That is a perfect way to frame the tension. And listening to them argue over the exact same Greek words is where the real insight happens for anyone studying this text.
Let's set the scene before we let them loose on the text. Where does this letter sit historically? Because Paul didn't plant the church in Rome, correct?
That is the single most important piece of context. This is the only letter Paul wrote to a church he didn't start.
He is writing to strangers.
Right. And which explains the length. He can't use shorthand. He can't say, hey, remember what I told you last summer when I was there?
He has to lay out the entire foundation.
From scratch. Schreiner points this out beautifully. He calls Romans a bridgehead. Think about Paul's career. He has conquered the East. He's planted churches all over Greece, Asia Minor, Macedonia. Now he has his eyes on the edge of the known world. Spain!
He wants to go to Spain.
He does. He mentions it later in the letter. But you can't just walk to Spain. It's a massive undertaking. You need a base of operations. You need funding. You need prayer. You need logistics. Rome is that base. It's the capital of the empire. If he can get Rome on board, he can take the gospel to the ends of the earth.
So to be slightly cynical about it, this letter is a fundraising document.
In the highest stakes way possible, yes. But to get their support, he has to prove he isn't a heretic. You have to remember, there are rumors flying around about Paul.
What kind of rumors?
Things like, he's the guy who says you don't need the Jewish law, or he's the guy who says we can sin so grace abounds. That makes the Jewish Christians in Rome very nervous.
So he has to lay out his entire theological architecture to win their trust. He's presenting his portfolio.
Precisely. And the structure of the chapter reflects that anxiety. Look at the salutation in verses 1 through 7. Schreiner notes this is the longest greeting Paul ever wrote in any letter.
Usually it's just Paul to the church in Corinth, grace and peace.
Right. Quick and to the point. Here, it goes on for 7 dense verses. He's flashing his badge. He is establishing his credentials immediately. I am an apostle. I am set apart for the gospel of God. This gospel was promised beforehand in the Holy Scriptures. He is building a fortress of authority before he even gets to hello.
Let's look at that salutation, because there is a phrase in verse 5 that seems to be the first landmine our scholars step on. Paul says his mission is to bring about the obedience of faith.
Hypako pistis.
It sounds nice and religious in English, but grammatically, I know it's a headache.
It's a genitive phrase, which in Greek acts like the word of. The problem is, of is vague. Does he mean obedience and faith? Like two separate things. Does he mean the obedience that comes from faith? Or does he mean obedience that is faith?
Why does that distinction matter so much?
It matters because of the centuries-old battle between faith and works. If you say obedience, A-N-D, faith, you sound like you're saying we earn salvation by being good plus believing.
Which Paul is generally against.
Violently against. So the minimum consensus, and this is important, all 3 of our scholars agree on the big picture here, is that you cannot separate them. You can't have faith without obedience. If you say you believe but your life doesn't change, Paul would say your belief is a hallucination.
But they nuance the grammar differently.
They do. Moo and Schreiner take the view that this likely means obedience that flows from faith. Faith is the root, obedience is the fruit. They are protecting the priority of faith. You believe, and because you believe, you obey.
That's the classic Protestant formulation. Faith alone, but faith is never alone.
Right. It preserves the order of operations. But Gaventa takes a slight turn. She says it's about living in the realm of faith.
The realm, like a territory.
Yes. For her, faith isn't just an internal psychological decision. It's a location. You move out of the territory of sin and into the territory of faith. So obedience of faith is behavior that reflects your new allegiance. It's less about a sequence first, I believe, than I obey, and more about a sphere of existence. You obey because you are now under a new king.
That feels like the apocalyptic lens kicking in. It's about cosmic territory, not just individual psychology.
It is. And we see that lens again in verse 4. Paul talks about the spirit of holiness.
Which I assume is just a high church way of saying the Holy Spirit.
Moo and Schreiner say exactly that. They argue it refers to the third person of the Trinity. Schreiner points out the contrast in the text. Jesus is born of the seed of David according to the flesh, but declared Son of God according to the Spirit. It's a flesh and spirit contrast. Human lineage versus divine vindication.
Standard theology.
Standard, yes. But Gaventa highlights a specific Greek phrase there, endyname. In power. She argues Paul isn't just balancing natures, human versus divine. She says Jesus was declared Son of God in power at the resurrection. This sets the agenda for the whole letter. It's not just about Jesus being holy. It's about Jesus being powerful enough to break the deadlock of death. For Gaventa, the resurrection is an invasion.
I love that image. It changes it from a theological fact you assent to a military action you get swept up in. Which brings us to the thesis. Verses 16 and 17.
At the core of the entire letter.
Paul writes, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation. And then he says, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed.
Stop right there. That phrase, dikaiosenoi, the righteousness of God, is probably the single most debated phrase in Pauline theology.
Why? I mean, God is righteous. It seems pretty straightforward to a modern reader.
But what does it mean for us? Does it mean God is a righteous person? Does it mean he demands righteousness from us? Does it mean he gives us righteousness? Or does it mean he acts righteously to save us?
And this is where our commentators draw their battle lines.
They really do. On one side, you have the forensic view. This is Mu and Schreiner. They argue that the righteousness of God is primarily a gift of status.
Walk me through that. What does a gift of status look like?
Imagine a courtroom. You are guilty. You did the crime. The evidence is irrefutable. But the judge bangs the gavel and declares you not guilty.
So I haven't actually changed internally. I'm still the guy who did the crime.
In that exact moment of justification, yes, it is a legal standing. Schreiner is very specific here. He is fighting against a modern view, often called the New Perspective, that says righteousness just means God keeping his covenant promises to Israel. Schreiner looks at the Greek and the Old Testament background and says, no, this is about a gift of right standing given to people who don't deserve it.
So for Schreiner and Mu, the righteousness of God is something God gives to me. It's my get-out-of-jail-free card, essentially.
That's a crude way to put it, but yes. It's a status transfer. And for them, this is the heart of the gospel. If you lose this, you lose the assurance of salvation. Because if it depends on you actually becoming righteous in your behavior, you're in trouble. But if it depends on the judge declaring you righteous, you're safe.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about absolute security before God. But then you turn to Gaventa.
The general.
What does she say? She's not buying the courtroom.
She pushes back hard. She says, if you only see this as a legal transaction, you miss the earth-shaking nature of the gospel. For her, the righteousness of God is God's rectifying power.
Rectifying power. Unpack that.
It means God coming in to set the world right. It's not just a status, it's an event, it's an activity. It is God invading the world to liberate it from sin and death. She says it's not just a judge banging a gavel, it's a warrior liberating a captive city.
That is a massive difference in tone. One feels very individual and quiet. I am saved. The other feels cosmic and loud. The world is being fixed.
And the beauty of a deep dive like this is realizing you probably need both. But the tension is real between the scholars. Schreiner worries that if you make it all about power, you lose the specific, beautiful promise that I, as an individual sinner, am justified. Gaventa worries that if you make it all about legal status, you turn the gospel into a dry, abstract transaction and miss the explosion of new creation life.
Speaking of explosions, verse 17 ends with that famous quote from the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk, "The righteous shall live by faith." But Paul precedes it with this phrase, "from faith to faith."
Ik pistis eis pistin, literally out of faith into faith.
What does that progression mean? From faith to faith?
If you ask Schreiner and Mu, it's emphatic. It means faith through and through. Faith from start to finish. It's Paul's way of saying, don't you dare try to add works to this. It excludes human effort entirely. It starts with faith, it ends with faith.
Simple, clean, protective of grace. Gaventa, however, suggests it implies the grasp of the gospel. It could mean from God's faithfulness to human faith, or the spread of the message from Jew to Gentile. For her, it's about the movement of the gospel. It's dynamic, it's traveling.
It's moving across the battlefield.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the good news. The gospel is power. The gospel is status. But then we hit verse 18, and the mood shifts dramatically. Paul writes, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness."
The transition word here is gar. It means for. And it's weird. Why follow, here's the great news of the gospel with for the wrath of God is revealed?
Yeah, usually you'd say, but the wrath of God.
Right. Mu says this is preparation. He argues you have to understand the bad news, the wrath, to appreciate the good news, the righteousness. It's logical. You need a diagnosis before you appreciate the cure.
That makes sense. I don't need a doctor unless I know I'm sick.
But Gaventa says it's concurrent. The gospel actually reveals the wrath.
Wait, explain that. How does good news reveal wrath?
Think about it this way. If you were sitting in a pitch black room, you don't know how dirty it is. You don't know there are rats in the corner. You might think everything is totally fine. But when you turn on the light, the gospel, suddenly you see the filth. You see the danger. Gaventa argues that we didn't realize how enslaved we were until the liberator showed up. The apocalypse of righteousness in verse 17 and the apocalypse of wrath in verse 18 happen together. The light creates the shadows.
That is profound. So the wrath isn't just God losing his temper. It's the reality of our objective situation being exposed by the presence of Jesus.
Yes. And that leads us to the mechanism of this wrath. This is the scariest part of the chapter. 3 times Paul says God handed them over. Eerdmans.
Handed them over. It sounds like a prisoner exchange. Or just giving up.
It implies a release. Schreiner calls this judicial abandonment. God steps back. He removes his restraining hand. He says, you want a life without me? Okay, you can have it.
So the lightning bolt isn't the punishment.
No. The freedom is the punishment. The result is moral disintegration. The punishment of sin is more sin. It's a downward spiral.
That's terrifying because it means the person being punished probably thinks they are free. They're getting exactly what they desire.
Precisely. They think they're liberating themselves, but really they are disintegrating. Now, Gaventa connects this handed over language to her powers thesis. She says God hands them over to the power of sin. It's a captivity narrative. God allows the tyrant of sin to take the reins for a moment to show humanity what that tyrant really looks like.
And what is the root cause? Why does God hand them over in the first place?
Idolatry. That is the fundamental sin in Romans 1.
Not the long list of bad behaviors at the end of the chapter, the envy, murder, strife.
No, those are symptoms. Schreiner is very clear on this. The root problem is the exchange. Verse 23, they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images. They worship the creature rather than the creator.
So everything else, the social decay, the broken relationships, the sexual immorality, that's all just downstream from the worship problem.
Mu puts it this way. Ungodliness, which is the vertical problem with God, leads to unrighteousness, which is the horizontal problem with people. If you get the vertical axis wrong, the horizontal axis inevitably snaps.
We have to talk about the specific examples Paul uses here, because they are the most controversial part of the letter in our modern context. Paul focuses heavily on sexual ethics in verses 26 and 27.
He does. And our scholars don't shy away from it, though they frame it through their specific theological lenses, which is helpful to see.
How does Schreiner handle it?
Schreiner is very firm on the unnatural language. Paul talks about women exchanging natural relations for unnatural ones, and men likewise. Schreiner argues this refers back to the created order in Genesis. He sees it as a reversal. Just as humans reversed God's glory for idols, they are now reversing the created order of male and female. For him, it's about violating the design specs of humanity.
And Gaventa.
She agrees it reflects confusion, but she ties it back to the mind. Remember, she focuses on the cosmic powers blinding us. She says the confusion of creator and creature leads to the confusion of bodies. It's a symptom of a world that has lost its mind. It's nous in Greek. It's less about breaking a specific rule and more about the collapse of distinctions in a world that has turned away from God.
So for both, it's a tragedy. It's a sign of a world that is out of joint.
Yes, and it's crucial to note, and Moog points this out explicitly, Paul isn't picking on this sin because it's the worst sin. He's picking on it because it is the clearest visual illustration of the exchange. Idolatry is exchanging the real God for a fake one. Paul sees same-sex behavior in this context as exchanging the natural for the unnatural. He uses it as a vivid metaphor for what humanity has done to God.
That's a key distinction. It's an illustration of the theological problem, not necessarily a ranking of sins.
Right. And as we will see when we get to the end of the deep dive today, Paul is setting a trap here. He is getting his Jewish readers to nod along and say, yes, look at those terrible pagans. He is building up their self-righteousness so he can absolutely demolish it in chapter 2.
A rhetorical setup. I love it. But before we get to the trap, we have to look at one more massive debate between our scholars. This is the Faith of Christ showdown.
Oh, this is the heavyweight championship of biblical grammar.
It sounds so technical, Pistis Christo, but the implications are huge.
Huge. The phrase actually appears heavily in Romans 3, but the concept is set up right here in chapter 1. The Greek phrase pistis Christo can be translated 2 ways. It's a genitive. It can mean faith in Christ, that's the objective genitive, or it can mean the faith of Christ, that's the subjective genitive.
Break that down for someone who hasn't taken Greek. What's the theological difference?
If it's faith in Christ, then I am the one doing the believing. The object of my faith is Jesus. This is the traditional view. Mu and Schreiner are firmly in this camp.
Why are they so firm on it?
Because they want to emphasize human responsibility. They argue that throughout Romans, Paul contrasts works trying to earn salvation with faith trusting God. If you take human faith out of the equation, they feel you lose the personal necessity of believing. Schreiner argues, look, humans are the ones who believe. The text says to everyone who believes, it's something we do.
Okay, that makes sense. If I don't have to believe, then everyone is automatically safe.
That's the fear, universalism. But what is the faith of Christ view?
This is Gaventa's camp.
It is. She prefers to translate it as Jesus Christ's faith. She argues that faith here refers to Christ's own faithfulness, his obedience, his fidelity to God, even unto death on a cross.
So it's not my faith saving me, it's his faithfulness saving me.
Exactly. She argues that faith isn't just a decision humans make, it is something generated by the Christ event. We are overtaken by Christ's faithfulness.
Why does she prefer that reading?
Because she fears that if we make it faith in Christ, we turn faith into a new kind of work. We turn it into something I have to do. I have to believe hard enough to get saved. If it's the faith of Christ, then salvation is entirely God's action. It sweeps us up. It's not about my little decision. It's about his massive faithfulness.
That is actually really relieving when you think about it.
It is, isn't it? It takes the pressure off our fragile ability to believe perfectly. But Schreiner would say, be careful. If it's all Christ's faithfulness, do I have to do anything? Doesn't the Bible call me to actively believe?
So we have the defender ensuring we don't lose personal responsibility and the apocalypticist ensuring we don't turn faith into a merit badge.
And honestly, the tension between them is probably where the truth lives. You need both. You need the faithfulness of Christ to make salvation historically possible, and you need the response of faith to receive it personally.
I want to try to synthesize this. We've had the jurist, the defender, and the general. We've talked about status, power, idolatry, and faith. If we had to boil Romans 1 down into one big idea sentence based on all three scholars, what would it look like?
That's a tall order, but let's try to thread the needle. How about this? The gospel is the apocalyptic invasion of God's rectifying power.
That's Gaventa.
Revealed in the face of a humanity that has been handed over to the destructive power of its own idolatry.
That's the indictment we see everyone agreeing on.
Offering a status of righteousness that is received by faith alone.
And that's Mu and Schreiner anchoring the end.
Let me say it all together. The gospel is the apocalyptic invasion of God's rectifying power, revealed in the face of a humanity that has been handed over to the destructive power of its own idolatry, offering a status of righteousness that is received by faith alone.
Boom. Put that on a t-shirt.
Yeah.
Or maybe a very long bumper sticker.
It's a dense bumper sticker, but it's theologically accurate.
So what does this mean for you, the listener? For the person driving to work or washing dishes right now? We aren't in first century Rome. We aren't trying to fund a mission to Spain.
No, but we are certainly in a culture that feels like it's fraying at the edges.
So point one for our application bridge, the diagnosis of culture.
This is where Schreiner and Mu's insight on Handed Over is so painfully relevant. When you look at the world as societal breakdown, addiction, confusion, rage, it's easy to just say, oh, people are making bad choices. We just need better education or better policies. But Romans 1 says no. This is a sign of God's passive wrath.
We're seeing the result of the exchange.
Exactly. We worship the creature, money, sex, power, self, and now we are living in the disintegration that follows. The application is stop being surprised by the chaos. It is the inevitable result of idolatry. And stop thinking you can fix the chaos without fixing the worship.
That leads to point two, the nature of the gospel.
This is Gaventa's moment to shine. If the problem is that we are enslaved to powers of sin, then a self-help book isn't going to fix it. Good advice isn't going to fix it.
We need an invasion.
Right. If you feel handed over to something, maybe it's an addiction, maybe it's bitterness, maybe it's just overwhelming despair, the gospel isn't a list of rules to get you out. It is dynamis. It is power. It is the only thing strong enough to break the lock on the prison door.
That's incredibly helpful. It takes the pressure off me to fix myself. I need a rescuer, not a life coach.
Exactly. And finally, point 3, the equality of need.
This is the spoiler for the next deep dive.
Romans 1 is a trap. It lists all the sins of the pagan world. And it's very easy for religious people or just good moral people to read it and feel superior. Well, I don't do that.
I pay my taxes. I love my spouse. I'm not like those people.
And Paul is waiting for you to say that, because in chapter 2, he's going to turn the guns on the moralists. But the application for chapter 1 is this: no one can look down on anyone else. We are all in the exact same boat. We are either handed over to sin or we are rescued by the gospel. There is no middle ground of I'm doing okay on my own.
That levels the playing field completely.
It destroys human pride, and that destruction of pride is the prerequisite for receiving grace.
This has been an intense journey through just one chapter.
It's Romans. It's always intense.
Before we close out, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought to mull over. You mentioned that Gaventa sees the gospel as an apocalyptic invasion, and Schreiner sees the world as being handed over.
Yes.
Here is my question for everyone listening. If the gospel is an invasion of power, why do we so often treat it like a philosophy? Why do we treat it like just a set of ideas we assent to? And if Schreiner is right that God hands people over, at what point does a society or a person pass the point of no return? Is there a point where the handing over is final?
That is the terrifying question. And the hopeful answer is in the power of the gospel to reach even the most handed-over person. But it is a very sobering thought to end on.
Next time, we walk into the trap. Chapter 2, Paul takes on the judge. If you thought Chapter 1 was harsh, wait until you hear what he has to say to the good religious people.
I can't wait.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you in the next one.